My name is Rachel Doyle, I'm 31, and 6 weeks ago a radiologist called me at 8:14 on a Tuesday morning to tell me the numbness in my left leg wasn't in my head, and in the same breath, mentioned something that made my whole body go cold in a completely different way. Miss Doyle, I want to be straightforward with you, Dr. Anita Reyes said. The MRI shows a lesion on your spinal cord at the 6th level, consistent with a demyelinating condition. This kind of lesion doesn't usually appear overnight. Based on the scarring pattern, I'd estimate this has been developing for at least 4, maybe 5 years. 4 or 5 years. I sat down hard on the edge of my bathtub, phone pressed to my ear, and did the math without even meaning to. 5 years ago, I was 26, newly married, and spending 8 months of that year in and out of urgent cares and one very expensive ER visit, describing tingling in my leg, blurred vision in one eye. A heaviness that made stairs feel like wading through wet sand, and being told over and over by doctors, by my mother, and most of all by my older sister Catherine that I was anxious, that I was exaggerating. That healthy 30-year-olds don't get whatever I thought I had. Dr. Reyes kept talking, walking me through terms like paraventricular white matter, possible relapsing course, referral to neurology as soon as possible, but I'll be honest, most of it went past me in a blur. I was still stuck on the phrase 4, maybe 5 years. I remember staring at the bathroom tile, counting grout lines, trying to physically ground myself in something while my mind ran backward through half a decade of appointments where I'd been told I was fine. Catherine wasn't just my sister who said that. Catherine was a physician assistant. She'd worked in the neurology department at Fairview Regional, the exact hospital where I'd had that ER visit 5 years earlier, the exact hospital where, it turned out, I'd already had an MRI back then, one nobody had ever fully explained to me. I remember, in that first minute after Dr. Reyes hung up, feeling something strange happen in my chest, not just fear, but a kind of vindication so sharp it almost felt like guilt for feeling it at all. 5 years of being told I was fine, that I was catastrophizing, that I needed to see a therapist instead of a neurologist, and now a stranger on the phone was confirming, in careful clinical language, that my body had been telling the truth the entire time. I hung up with Dr. Reyes and just sat there for a long time, phone loose in my hand, listening to the pipes tick as the shower I'd never turned on cooled down on its own. My husband Owen found me 20 minutes later, still sitting on the edge of the tub, and the first thing I said to him wasn't, "I have a diagnosis." It was, "I need my old records from Fairview, all of them. Every page." I want to ask you something because I think about this moment constantly. Have you ever had someone in your own family, someone you trusted, someone with actual medical training, look you dead in the eye and tell you that what your body was screaming at you wasn't real? Tell me in the comments, because after that phone call, I started pulling every record I could get my hands on, and what I found wasn't just 5 years of my life stolen by a misdiagnosis. It was proof that someone in my family already knew. Let me take you back, because you need to understand what those 5 years actually looked like from the inside, not just as a line on a chart. I was 26, married to Owen for about a year, working as a middle school art teacher in Dayton, Ohio, when the symptoms started. Tingling in my left foot that crept up to my knee over a few weeks, the kind of pins and needles feeling you get when your foot falls asleep, except it never fully went away. Then, one Sunday afternoon while grading a stack of papier-mâché mask projects, the left side of my vision went blurry for almost 20 minutes, like looking through a smeared window, colors bleeding into each other at the edges. Owen drove me to the Fairview Regional ER that night, both of us more scared than we let on to each other. I remember the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the paper gown that never quite closed right, a resident named Dr. Acaffer who was kind but clearly rushed, ordering blood work and eventually an MRI of my brain and spine just to rule things out. I remember being wheeled into that machine, the clanging and thumping of it. 35 minutes of trying not to move while my mind spiraled through every worst-case scenario I could think of. And then I remember almost nothing concrete after that, which is the part that used to make me doubt myself the most. I was told the scan didn't show anything acute, given a referral to a neurologist that somehow never got scheduled correctly, and sent home with a diagnosis of probable anxiety with somatic symptoms. A follow-up appointment got lost in a scheduling error. I called twice, sat on hold for what felt like 45 minutes each time, and eventually gave up, telling myself it probably wasn't important if nobody seemed to be chasing it either. Over the following years, the symptoms would flare and fade in a pattern I couldn't predict. A numb patch on my thigh that would show up for a week and vanish. A wave of fatigue so heavy it flattened me for days, where even lifting a coffee mug felt like an accomplishment. One terrifying afternoon at school, in front of a room full of 7th graders, my right hand simply stopped cooperating, a paintbrush slipping out of fingers that wouldn't close around it properly, my face going hot with embarrassment as I tried to laugh it off in front of 12-year-olds who were staring at me. Every single time I brought it up to my family, and every single time Catherine was the one who reframed it, gently at first, then less gently as the years went on. "You had a full workup at Fairview, Rachel. They didn't find anything. You need to stop Googling symptoms at 2 in the morning. Mom, she does this. She reads one article about MS and suddenly she has every symptom on the list. I work in neurology, Rachel. If something were actually wrong with you, I would know. I would be the first one telling you to get checked out. I'm telling you not to worry." That last line is the one that haunted me most once I understood what she'd actually known. Because Catherine didn't just dismiss my symptoms as a skeptical bystander with a medical degree adjacent to my situation. She positioned herself as the family authority who had supposedly already ruled it out on my behalf, using her actual credentials as a kind of shield that made every other person in the family stop questioning it too. My mother deferred to her. My father, never one to push back on medical matters, deferred to both of them. And I, exhausted and increasingly unsure of my own body, eventually deferred as well. By the time I called Dr. Ray's back that Tuesday morning to ask a single, simple question, whether Fairview Regional had any record of a prior scan from 5 years earlier, I already had a sick, sinking feeling about what the answer would be. It took me 9 days to get my old medical records released, which doesn't sound long until you're the one waiting, replaying 5 years of your life while a records department processes a HIPAA authorization form that seemed to move at the speed of a glacier. I called the medical records office at Fairview Regional 3 separate times during that stretch, each time getting a slightly different answer about processing timelines, each time hanging up more frustrated than before. On the 9th day, an email finally landed in my inbox, a password-protected PDF, 340 pages, everything from the last decade of my scattered visits to that hospital system. I opened it at my kitchen table with Owen sitting across from me, both of us silent, like we were bracing for a verdict neither of us wanted to hear out loud. The old radiology report was there, dated 5 years and 2 months earlier, authored by a Dr. Marcus Felt, who I vaguely remembered as an older radiologist who'd since retired. I only knew his name because it had been stamped at the top of a form I'd signed on my way out of the ER that night, one of a dozen papers I hadn't actually read. The impression line at the bottom of his report read, "Findings suggestive of demyelinating process. Recommend neurology follow-up and consideration of lumbar puncture for further evaluation." Nothing acute. Not unremarkable. A radiologist had flagged exactly what Dr. Ray's was now telling me, 5 years later in far more advanced form. I felt my hands go cold reading it, my thumb hovering over the screen like touching it too hard might make the words rearrange themselves into something less damning. Somewhere between that report being filed and me being sent home with an anxiety diagnosis, something had gone very wrong, or someone had made sure it did. I scrolled further and found the chart notes from that ER visit. Dr. Acaffer's discharge summary referenced the radiology findings accurately, noting neurology referral placed per radiology recommendation. So the referral had existed. It had been placed correctly, exactly the way it should have been. Which meant the breakdown happened somewhere between that referral being placed and me never actually getting the follow-up appointment I needed, somewhere in a gap that, up until that moment, I had simply chalked up to an overwhelmed hospital system and my own failure to follow up hard enough. That's when I found the note that changed everything. Buried in an internal communications log, the kind of administrative trail most patients never think to request, but that I asked for specifically because 8 years of working alongside hospital administration in my own career had taught me these systems keep records of nearly everything. If you know to ask, was a message logged 3 days after my ER visit. It was a note from the neurology scheduling coordinator documenting a phone call. Received call from K. Doyle, PA, Neuro Department, requesting hold on referral pending discussion with patient's family. Family aware will advise on next steps. K. Doyle, Catherine Doyle, my sister. I read that line 4 times before it fully landed. She hadn't just dismissed my symptoms in casual conversation over the years at dinner tables and phone calls and worried texts I'd sent her at midnight. She had called the scheduling department at her own workplace, using her professional standing, and personally intervened to stop my referral before it ever became an actual appointment on a calendar. Owen reached across the table and took the laptop gently out of my hands, not to hide it from me, just because my fingers had started shaking too much to keep scrolling steadily. "Read it again," I said once I'd caught my breath. He did, out loud this time, slower, and hearing it in his voice somehow made it more real than reading it silently ever had. There was a version of that night where I could have told myself I'd misread it, that K. Doyle, PA, was some other Catherine Doyle who happened to work in the same department. Some coincidence my anxious brain was inflating into something sinister. But Fairview Regional's neurology department had exactly one PA with that name, and I knew it. And some small, stubborn part of me had probably known it the moment I first requested those records. I printed 3 copies that night, one for myself, one I mailed to my own address as a kind of insurance in case anything ever mysteriously went missing from a hospital database, and one I tucked into an envelope I didn't yet know what I'd do with, though some part of me already suspected it would end up on a family dinner table. I called Catherine that same night before I'd even fully processed what I was reading, because some things you can't sit on until morning. "I need to ask you about something," I said, my voice tighter than I meant it to sound. 5 years ago, after my ER visit at Fairview, did you call the neurology scheduling department? There was a pause. Not the confused pause of someone who genuinely didn't remember, a different kind, tighter, the kind you learn to recognize when you spend years reading people's faces for signs of what they're not saying out loud, whether it's in a hospital hallway or your own family's kitchen. "Rachel, I don't remember every phone call from 5 years ago. There's a note in my chart. It says a K. Doyle called and asked them to hold my neurology referral pending a conversation with the family." "That's you, right? That has to be you. Where did you even get access to internal scheduling notes?" I want you to notice what she asked. Not "that's not true." Not "let me explain, let me walk you through what happened." She asked how I'd gotten the information, which told me more than any denial could have, because it meant her first instinct wasn't confusion or concern for me, it was containment. "I requested my full record, Catherine. All of it. Because 6 weeks ago a different doctor told me I have a spinal lesion that's been developing for 5 years, and I want to know why nobody caught it sooner when apparently somebody already had." Another long pause, long enough that I could hear her breathing shift on the other end of the line. "I was trying to protect you," she finally said. "You were newly married, you were already anxious about everything, and demyelinating findings on an MRI can mean a dozen different things, most of which resolve on their own. I didn't want you spiraling into a full-blown health crisis over something that might have been nothing." "It wasn't nothing, Catherine. It's not nothing now. I have permanent nerve damage they're telling me might have been preventable. You don't know that the delay changed anything." That sentence, "you don't know that the delay changed anything," is the one I couldn't let go of because it wasn't an apology. It was a legal argument, the exact kind of sentence a person says when they've already started thinking about how to defend themselves rather than how to make things right with the person on the other end of the phone. "I need you to actually hear me," I said, my voice cracking despite every effort to keep it level. "For 5 years I doubted my own body because you told me to. I stopped bringing up symptoms to doctors because I was embarrassed, because my own sister, a medical professional, told me I was making it up. I never said you were making it up. You said I was exaggerating, over and over. That word specifically more times than I can count." She didn't have an answer for that. I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back, and I sat in my kitchen for a long time afterward, staring at that scheduling note still open on my laptop screen, understanding for the first time that my sister hadn't just failed to help me. She had actively worked, using her professional access, to keep me from finding out the truth, and then spent 5 years making sure I never had a reason to look. Owen had been quiet through most of the call, listening from across the table, and once I hung up, he asked the question that had clearly been building in him the whole time. "Why would she do that? What would she even get out of stalling your referral? It doesn't make sense unless there's something else going on." It's a fair question, and I want to be honest with you about the answer, because I don't think Catherine is some kind of cartoon villain who woke up one day and decided to hurt me for fun. I think what happened is smaller and sadder, and in its own way, more human than that, even if it doesn't make it forgivable. Catherine had been a PA at Fairview Regional for 6 years at that point, working directly under the neurology department's supervising physician, Dr. Warren Talbot. A man notorious, I would later learn from 2 of Catherine's former coworkers I quietly reached out to, for an explosive temper when it came to anything that looked like it might expose the department to a malpractice claim. Talbot had, 2 years before my ER visit, been named in a lawsuit over a delayed cancer diagnosis that had cost the hospital a substantial settlement, and had resulted in a much stricter internal review process for missed or delayed referrals, one where staff names got attached to every step of a case file. Owen sat with that for a moment, turning his water glass slowly on the table. So she panicked because of something that happened to someone else in a completely different case, and you're the one who ended up paying for it. I think that's basically it, I said. If Catherine had flagged, or even privately worried, that a radiology finding suggestive of something serious had come through the ER on her own sister without a clean, immediate follow-up, and if there was any chance that delay could later be traced back to a phone call she personally made, that wasn't just a family problem for her anymore. It was a career problem, in a department where her supervising physician had already shown he'd throw people under the bus to protect the department's clean record. I think, and I want to stress this is what I've come to believe rather than something she's ever fully admitted in those exact words, that Catherine made an initial, panicked decision to slow things down and manage the situation quietly rather than let it become an official, documented delay that could be traced back to her. And then, once that first phone call was made, she couldn't undo it without admitting what she'd done, so instead, for 5 years she doubled down, turning me into the family hypochondriac, so thoroughly that nobody, including me, ever seriously questioned why my neurology referral had simply evaporated into nothing. That doesn't excuse it, it explains it. And there's a difference between those two things that took me weeks to fully sit with, turning it over in my head during long, sleepless nights while Owen slept beside me, unaware I was still awake, still doing math on years I couldn't get back. 3 weeks after that phone call, my mother insisted on a family dinner, her way, I think, of trying to smooth things over before they got worse, though it accomplished the exact opposite. I brought printouts. I know that probably sounds cold, showing up to a family dinner with a folder of medical records instead of a bottle of wine. But by that point I had learned the hard way that in this family, without documentation sitting right there on the table, my version of events simply got argued away, softened, reframed until it sounded like my own overreaction rather than someone else's decision. My mother, Diane, tried to keep the conversation light through the first course, a pot roast she'd clearly spent all afternoon on, the kind of dinner she made when she wanted everyone to feel like nothing was wrong. I could feel Catherine watching me from across the table the entire time, waiting to see what I'd brought and how I planned to use it, her fork moving food around her plate without much of it actually reaching her mouth. When I finally set the folder down next to my plate, the temperature in the room changed instantly, the easy chatter dying mid-sentence. "Rachel, please don't do this at dinner," my mother said, her eyes flicking nervously toward Catherine. "I'm not trying to ruin dinner, Mom. I'm trying to understand why, for 5 years, everyone in this family treated me like I was making things up, when there was a radiology report sitting in a file at Fairview that said otherwise." My father, David, who had mostly stayed out of the health conversations over the years, a quiet, avoidant man who dealt with conflict by finding a reason to be in a different room, surprised me by speaking up, setting down his own fork with a small, deliberate click against the plate. "What report? What are you talking about, Rachel?" I slid a copy across the table. He read it slowly, his jaw tightening in a way I hadn't seen since I was a teenager and had missed curfew badly enough to actually worry him. "This says, recommend neurology follow-up. Catherine, did you know about this?" Catherine's face did something I'd only seen once before, back in that phone call, a brief flash of something unguarded, almost young, before the professional composure slid back into place like a mask settling back over her features. I saw the initial imaging, yes, when I was covering a shift and it came across the department. I didn't think it was as significant as it apparently turned out to be. "You told the scheduling department to hold my referral," I said, keeping my voice level even as my heart pounded. That's not the same as thinking it wasn't significant. That's actively stopping the process before it could even begin. I made a judgment call, Catherine said, her voice rising slightly defensive in a way that surprised even her, I think, based on how quickly she reined it back in. I was 26 years old myself, working under a supervising physician who made my life hell over anything that looked like a liability issue, and I panicked. I thought I was buying us time to get you into a specialist quietly, without it becoming this whole official incident report that could blow back on both of us. On both of us? I repeated, my voice going flat. Catherine, it wasn't your spine, it was mine. My mother started to say something conciliatory, some version of let's not do this here. But my father cut her off gently, still staring at the report in his hands like it might rearrange itself into something less damning if he looked hard enough. The exact same instinct I'd had at my kitchen table weeks earlier. Nobody finished their pot roast that night. Catherine left early, claiming an early shift the next morning that I later found out didn't actually start until noon. My mother cried quietly while clearing plates that were still mostly full, waving off my offer to help. And my father sat at the table long after everyone else had scattered, rereading that single-page report over and over as though repetition might soften what it said. I drove home that night with the folder still on the passenger seat beside me, feeling less like I'd won an argument and more like I'd detonated something that had been sitting, live and unnoticed, at the center of our family for half a decade. That dinner might have ended there in a painful but survivable standoff if my father hadn't done something none of us expected. 2 days later, he called me and asked to meet for coffee alone, no explanation given over the phone about why. He'd gone back to Fairview Regional himself, using his own status as my father and a limited records request, and asked for something specific. The internal peer review file connected to the scheduling delay, the kind of document hospitals generate when a potential liability issue gets flagged internally, even if it never becomes a lawsuit. He'd worked in hospital administration decades earlier, before switching careers into insurance underwriting, and still knew, distantly, how these systems worked and who to ask, which forms to file, which department wouldn't simply stonewall a polite but persistent request. What came back, redacted in places but still damning in others, was a peer review memo dated about 8 months after my ER visit, nearly a year and a half before I ever learned any of this. It documented an internal audit that had flagged my case as one of several delayed referral incidents traced to the neurology scheduling coordinator's notes over an 18-month window. My name was in that file. Catherine's initials were in that file, listed as the staff member who had requested the hold. My father slid the pages across the small cafe table toward me, his hand not quite steady. I need you to read the last paragraph first, he said. That's the one that made me sick. The memo noted that the matter had been addressed directly with the staff member involved and resolved at the departmental level without escalation to formal incident reporting. In other words, the hospital had known internally for years that Catherine had inappropriately intervened in my referral. And instead of ever telling me, the patient whose care had actually been affected, they had quietly handled it as a personnel matter and moved on, protecting the department's clean record instead of protecting me. There was no line anywhere in that memo about notifying the affected patient. No line about revisiting my case. Just a quiet, bureaucratic closing of a file that should have changed the entire trajectory of my life. I sat with my father in that coffee shop, staring at a memo that proved this wasn't just a sister's panicked mistake anymore. It was an institutional cover-up, small in scale but real, where a hospital had chosen its own liability exposure over protecting the one person it actually owed the truth to. I want you to ask something for me, I told my father, my voice unsteady. Where were you watching from, back when all of this was supposedly happening under everyone's nose and nobody thought to tell me? I ask myself that same question about this whole family, honestly, and I still don't have a good answer for it. He didn't have an answer either. He just reached across the table and put his hand over mine, and for once, that was enough. I called a medical malpractice attorney named Priya Nair the following week, mostly to understand my options rather than because I'd already decided to sue anyone, least of all my own sister. Priya was blunt in the way I needed someone to be blunt with me at that point, laying things out in the same clear, unhurried tone Dr. Reyes had used weeks earlier. You have 2 separate issues here and they need to be treated separately, she said. One is a possible malpractice claim against Fairview Regional for the mishandled referral and the internal cover-up that followed. The statute of limitations in Ohio for medical claims typically runs from when you discovered, or reasonably should have discovered, the injury, and you only discovered this a few weeks ago, so you likely still have standing there. The other issue is your sister, and that's not really a legal question. That's a family one, and only you can decide how you want to handle that part. What happens to her professionally? If I pursue the first part? If it's substantiated that a PA used her position to delay a patient's referral, and that delay contributed to a preventable worsening of a diagnosed condition, that's the kind of thing that can end up in front of the state medical board, separate from whatever the hospital does internally. I won't sugarcoat that for you. It could affect her license, her ability to keep practicing the way she is now. I remember sitting with the phone against my ear for a long moment, thinking about the 26-year-old version of my sister, scared of a supervising physician who apparently made junior staff feel disposable. Panicking in a moment I genuinely believe she never expected to define the next 5 years of both our lives, never mind whatever came after. Take me through what filing would actually involve, I said, every step of it. I don't want to be surprised by any part of this. Priya walked me through the timeline: an initial demand letter to the hospital's risk management department, a likely months-long negotiation before anything reached a courtroom, the possibility of a settlement, the possibility of a formal medical board complaint running on a separate, parallel track. She was careful not to push me one way or the other, which I appreciated more than I expected to. I didn't decide anything that day. I told Priya I needed time, and she respected that, telling me the option to file would still be there in a month, in 3 months, whenever I was ready, as long as I didn't wait so long the window genuinely closed on me. That night I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I cried, not out of anger, though there was plenty of that still sitting in me, but out of something closer to grief, for the version of my life where I might have caught this 5 years earlier, started treatment sooner, maybe avoided some of the lasting nerve damage Dr. Reyes had gently warned me might now be permanent. Maybe never had to sit across a cafe table from my own father reading a memo that quietly erased my right to know the truth about my own body. I also spent a long time that week reading through Ohio's rules on peer review confidentiality, trying to understand, on my own, before Priya walked me through it formally, why a document that so directly concerned my care had been treated as internal and untouchable for over a year and a half. What I learned didn't make me feel better. Peer review protections exist, in theory, to encourage honest internal reporting among medical staff without fear of automatic litigation, a reasonable goal in the abstract. But sitting on the other side of it, as the patient those protections had quietly been used to shield information from, the fairness of that system felt a lot more theoretical than it probably does to the people who designed it. While I sat with the decision about the hospital and about Catherine, my own health couldn't wait for me to sort out my feelings, and honestly I was grateful for that. It gave me something concrete to focus on when everything else felt impossibly tangled. I started treatment under a new neurologist, Dr. Halima Suleiman, who was patient in a way that felt almost foreign to me after years of being made to feel like a burden every time I described a symptom. She spent our first appointment just listening, letting me talk for nearly 40 minutes without once cutting me off or reframing what I was saying, and I remember leaving that appointment feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Believed. She started me on a disease-modifying therapy, the first infusion happening on a gray October morning that I remember mostly for how strange it felt to finally be treated instead of dismissed. I sat in a recliner in a quiet infusion room, an IV line taped to the back of my hand, and watched the bag slowly empty over 90 minutes, thinking about how different this moment might have looked 5 years earlier if a phone call to a scheduling department had never happened. The prognosis, Dr. Suleiman told me honestly, was mixed. Because the condition had gone undiagnosed and untreated for so long, I already had some permanent damage. A persistent weakness in my left leg that physical therapy could improve, but likely never fully reverse, occasional numbness that came and went unpredictably, a tremor in my right hand under stress that hadn't been there before. If we'd caught it 5 years earlier at that first ER visit, the trajectory might have looked meaningfully different. Not necessarily perfect, but different, and that word might became its own kind of quiet grief I carried around for months. That might have is a hard thing to live with. I want to be honest that I didn't handle it gracefully all the time. There were weeks where I barely spoke to anyone in my family, where I snapped at Owen over things that had nothing to do with him, over dishes left in the sink or a missed grocery run, when really I was furious about something that had happened 5 years earlier and had nowhere else to put it. There were nights I lay awake doing the math on 5 wasted years over and over until it stopped meaning anything except pain, a loop of numbers and dates that never resolved into anything useful. Slowly, though, something else started happening alongside the anger. My father, who had spent most of my life avoiding hard conversations, started showing up in small, consistent ways, driving me to infusion appointments even though I could have driven myself. Sitting in the waiting room with a crossword he never actually finished, asking real questions about my symptoms instead of deflecting to Catherine's supposed expertise the way he always had before. My mother, to her credit, eventually stopped trying to smooth things over and instead told Catherine, in a conversation I wasn't present for but heard about secondhand from my father, that she needed to take real responsibility instead of explaining her way around it every time the subject came up. Catherine, for her part, didn't disappear or go on the defensive forever. About 6 weeks after that family dinner, she asked to meet me alone, without our parents mediating, without an audience to perform composure for. We met at a park near my house, not a restaurant, somewhere I could leave easily if I needed to. It was late afternoon, the kind of overcast day where the light stays flat and gray for hours, and I remember being grateful for that. It felt like the right weather for the conversation we were about to have. "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me," she said, before I'd even fully sat down on the bench, her hands wrapped tightly around a coffee cup she never drank from. "I don't think I've earned that, and I'm not sure I will for a long time, maybe ever. I just want you to actually hear what happened from me without me defending it, without turning it into an argument like I did at dinner." I let her talk. She told me that when the imaging came across her desk during that ER shift 5 years earlier, she genuinely panicked, not because she didn't care about me, but because Dr. Talbot had, weeks earlier, torn into a colleague in front of the entire department over a missed follow-up that had turned into a lawsuit, screaming loud enough that people 2 floors away had heard it. And Catherine had been terrified of being anywhere near a similar situation, especially involving a family member, where the lines between personal and professional would look messy under scrutiny. I told myself I was going to get you to a specialist quietly, outside the system, so it never had to become an official referral with my name attached to a delay, she said, staring at a point somewhere past my shoulder. And then weeks passed, and I didn't do that either, because bringing it up meant admitting I'd already interfered. And then it became easier to just believe my own story, that you were anxious, that it probably wasn't anything, than to face what I'd actually done. I think some part of me knew the whole time and just buried it under enough repetition that it stopped feeling like a lie. "You didn't just believe your own story, Catherine. You told everyone else to believe it too, for 5 years. You made me doubt myself in front of doctors, in front of Owen, in front of Mom and Dad." "I know," she said, and for the first time her voice actually broke, cracking down the middle in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids. "I know, and there's no version of me explaining the fear I felt at 26 that makes that okay. I let you carry a diagnosis I helped bury, and I let this whole family treat you like you were the unstable one, when I was the one hiding something the entire time." I didn't tell her that day whether I was going to pursue anything against the hospital, or against her specifically. I told her I needed more time, and that time, whatever I eventually decided to do with it, wasn't going to be rushed just because she was finally ready to apologize on a park bench on a gray afternoon. It took me another 2 months to decide what to do, and I want to walk you through that decision honestly, because I think people expect revenge stories to end with someone getting destroyed, and that's not quite what happened here. I ultimately did file a formal complaint with the state medical board, not against Catherine specifically as a person, but as a factual account of what the internal peer review memo had documented, because I believed, and still believe, that a hospital quietly burying an internal finding that a staff member interfered with a patient's referral was the kind of thing that needed to exist in a formal record. For my sake and for whoever else might have been affected by the same pattern I later learned wasn't entirely isolated to my case, Priya's investigation turned up 2 other, less clear-cut instances flagged in that same 18-month audit window. I chose not to pursue a malpractice claim against Catherine individually. Priya helped me file the complaint focused on the hospital's institutional handling of the peer review, the failure to notify me, rather than centering it as an attack on my sister's career, though I understood, going in, that the board's review would inevitably examine her role too, and there was no version of this where she came out of it untouched. The investigation took the better part of a year. There were setbacks along the way that tested my resolve more than once. A 6-week stretch where the hospital's legal team pushed back hard on releasing further documentation. An initial board response that felt frustratingly slow and noncommittal. A period where I genuinely wondered if I'd made the whole thing worse for nothing, dragging my family through a year-long process that might change nothing in the end. The board ultimately issued Catherine a formal reprimand and a period of supervised practice, rather than revoking her license outright, citing her cooperation once the investigation began, and the mitigating context of her age at the time, and the department's documented culture of retaliation against staff who raised liability concerns. Fairview Regional, separately, updated its referral tracking system, and under pressure from the board's findings, implemented a mandatory review process for any case where a staff member requests a hold on a patient referral involving a family member. A small, procedural change, but one that Priya told me could genuinely prevent a version of what happened to me from happening to someone else down the line. There was a point, about 7 months into the process, when the hospital's attorneys sent a letter offering a private settlement to close out the entire matter quietly. No board involvement, no further discovery, a dollar figure that Priya said was not nothing attached with a strict non-disclosure clause. I sat with that offer for 4 days, tempted more than once by the idea of simply being done with it, of letting a number close a chapter that had already cost me so much energy to keep open. In the end, I turned it down, not because the money didn't matter, but because a settlement with a gag clause would have meant the peer review memo, the scheduling note, all of it, would have gone right back into being invisible, exactly the kind of quiet burial that had caused this whole situation in the first place. It wasn't a cinematic victory. Nobody lost everything. Catherine kept her license, kept her career, though a formal reprimand now sits permanently in her professional record, something she'll have to disclose on every future job application for the rest of her working life. I still live with nerve damage that treatment 5 years earlier might have prevented. But something did change. The truth existed now, on paper, in a way it never had before, and that mattered more to me than I expected it to when I first started down this road. The year that followed wasn't a straight line toward reconciliation, and I don't want to pretend it was because that wouldn't be honest, and honesty is the entire reason any of this happened in the first place. There were months where Catherine and I didn't speak at all, where family gatherings involved careful seating arrangements and conversations that steered hard around anything medical, where my mother would call me privately beforehand just to check what topics were safe to bring up at whatever holiday we were both attending. My mother struggled with a kind of guilt I hadn't expected, not just about Catherine's role, but about her own years of telling me to stop Googling symptoms, of taking Catherine's professional authority at face value instead of listening to her own daughter's account of her own body. Slowly, in small increments, things shifted. Catherine started showing up to my infusion appointments sometimes, not to manage or explain anything, just to sit with me, quietly, the way a sister should have been doing for years, bringing a crossword of her own or just her phone, content to sit in the low hum of the infusion room without needing to fill the silence. She never asked me to say the words, "I forgive you," which I think in hindsight was the right call on her part. Those words came eventually on their own timeline, not because anyone pushed for them, but because enough small, consistent gestures finally outweighed 5 years of silence. I went back to teaching part-time, adjusting my classroom setup to accommodate the days my leg gave me more trouble than others, keeping a stool near the supply closet for the days I couldn't stand for a full period. Owen and I talked seriously, for the first time, about what a future with a chronic condition actually looked like for us, practically and emotionally, insurance considerations, what flare-ups might mean for the family we talked about starting, how we'd handle the unpredictability of it all, and came out the other side of those conversations steadier than I expected going in. People sometimes ask me whether I regret requesting my old records, given everything it dragged up, the family fractures, the drawn-out board investigation, the grief over 5 lost years that no outcome could actually give back to me, no matter how the paperwork resolved. I don't regret it, not because everything worked out perfectly, but because for the first time in 5 years I stopped doubting my own body. That single MRI result didn't just show a lesion. It gave me back a version of reality that had been quietly rewritten by someone I trusted. And once I had that reality back, I couldn't unsee it, and I wouldn't have wanted to, even knowing everything it would cost to pursue. I think about that 26-year-old version of Catherine sometimes, terrified in a department that punished honesty more than it punished harm, making a panicked decision that calcified into 5 years of silence, because admitting it early felt impossible, and admitting it late felt even worse. The gap between those two moments widening every single year she let it go unspoken. I understand her more than I probably should. Understanding isn't the same as excusing, and I've learned to hold both of those things at once without letting either one cancel the other out. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's that your own sense of your body is not something anyone else, no matter their credentials, no matter how much you love and trust them, gets to overwrite for you. Get the second opinion. Request the old records. Ask the uncomfortable question, even when the person on the other end of it is family, even when asking it might mean pulling a thread that unravels something you're not sure you're ready to see fully unraveled. I don't know if Catherine and I will ever be exactly what we were before that phone call 5 years ago. I think we're building something different now, something with more honesty in it, even if it's smaller and more careful than what came before, checked and rechecked in a way our relationship never used to require. That feels like enough most days. On the harder days, it doesn't, and I've learned to let that be true too, without needing to resolve it into something tidier than it actually is. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental. If it made you think about a symptom you've been talking yourself out of, or a person in your life who's talked you out of it for you, I hope it reminded you to trust the evidence over the excuse.